Well, Seamus always, it was one of his mantras. I think anybody who knew him would have heard him use the word document and documentation, and he really felt that it was important to kind of tell the story of things that happened, not just looking at the past, but to try and recognise the importance or unimportance of what is happening.
He managed to carve out that extraordinary niche in Cork, national, international, private, public, mythologizing, and yet, you know, being a kind of a very high elevated figure in the art world, but also a very humble, down-to-earth man. And the way he would refer to the stonemasons, you know, in that age-old expression as the dust.
Long Jim, then my grandfather drove the steam engine. It's one of Seamus's better busts is the portrait of his father, which is great. Like, I mean, gaunt face and the moustache.
Seamus always said his father was a totally silent man, and indeed he used to come down here on maybe a Sunday afternoon wearing his long black overcoat and his maybe a Homburg hat and his walking stick, and he would sit beside the range inside in the kitchen and say hello. And that was all he said, and he'd have the cup of tea and then he would go away.
Interesting man like that. He used to, on Harrington Square, just to annoy his wife, he used to go out on his day off and eat dandelions on his hands and knees. With the kids thought this was great fun, like, and he'd be around there, and it just used to freak out his wife. And he obviously had a sense of humour, but apparently he didn't talk that much, and he didn't like the church, and he took my father out of school early because he didn't like the church.
There's a letter here from Corkery in which he says of Seamus's father, James Murphy, Long Jim, he was one after my own heart, so much of a piece, so much his own self, always remaining what God had made him, not the least wish to be otherwise. If we see the head of Long Jim that Seamus made, it's one of Seamus's finest works, I think.
This, of course, is a head of Corkery, Daniel Corkery, a writer, professor, teacher. He was my teacher at St. Patrick's National School, and to him I would say that I owe everything, insofar as he was the first person to make me aware of what art was and not what art was. He would never discuss art, but how important drawing was and how important painting was, and saw that I went to the School of Art. From there I was collected as a stone carver. The man himself was very good because I wasn't the only one that Corkery looked after. He looked after anybody that he felt had talent. The wonderful thing about this is that it wasn't self-conscious. You didn't feel that you were being directed into a road. All you knew was that you were given things you wanted to do.
Corkery is the single most important figure in a sense in that attempt to try and bridge the old Ireland with the new modern Europe. And the fact that he was the teacher of Seamus Murphy in St. Patrick's National School in Cork is just one of those great coincidences. But it's not a coincidence because Cork is full of those things, and they're not accidents. And you know, there's that sense of culture that was implicit and embedded through the warp and weft of the city at every level that I think made that happen, enabled it to happen. A kind of a real sense of culture that as something that's just in the blood, not something that's necessarily learned, you know, and added on afterwards.
Our understanding of Corkery's influence on Seamus, and that I think it was very much Corkery who would have encouraged Seamus to go to the School of Art at night, because of course he never was a full-time day student. So Corkery, who was, I think, at that stage on the board in the Crawford. I think he was one of those, and he was also very important in UCC. So he had a very strong influence and used it, I think, to nurture, as you're saying, to nurture an Irish consciousness of what could be created by Irish people, practitioners in several forms. I mean, he was involved in drama as well, and I don't know if he was involved in music. He probably was.
As people who were producing Irish culture, it was very much in the tradition of cultural nationalism, or romantic nationalism of the time. Frank O'Connor actually speaks a lot about it in his autobiography, about the idea that he used to read English comics and such like until the influence of Daniel Corkery, and he started to realise that he had a culture of his own that he could follow instead. I think he would have taken he would have taken that approach as well. Corkery, with his, the idea of the hidden Ireland, the idea of this underlying Irish culture that had been repressed and hidden for so long and was finally getting a chance to kind of rise up and be visible. I think that is a very powerful idea that had an influence on an awful lot of people. I mean, it's been much criticised since, and it's been supported as well. There's been a lot of discussion about it, but I think you can't deny the powerful influence of that concept on a whole generation of Irish people.
Daniel Corkery, more than any other single intellectual of the 1920s, is the one writer and theorist who you can point to who was fully aware of modernism, of Ibsen, of international movements in theatre, who was fully aware of the rich vein of culture that there was in West Cork, Northwest Cork, particularly around Ballyvourney, the author of The Hidden Ireland.
They were great admirers of Daniel Corkery. Whom some of us in the generation farther on, like myself, would have regarded with a certain jaundiced eye, because in my book Corkery's vision was very narrow indeed, and he had quite an intolerant attitude towards the non-Gaelic traditions, as it were. But he remained a hero for people like Seamus and Murphy, and indeed there was this alternative Corkery court down in Fountainstown, where he lived in his retirement, and where they visited him regularly. And I remember on the day of his funeral in 1964, when I went back to the Palace Bar the day after the funeral, I think it was the Friday night, I was received with a certain coolness, because I hadn't turned up at Corkery's funeral. So there was that sense of belonging to, that they were the heirs of a particular philosopher whom they admired, an Irish Ireland philosopher. So there was that continuity there as well.
Under Corkery's inspiration, then he was able to get a scholarship to do night classes in the School of Art, and then he was apprenticed to John Aloysius O'Connell. And now John Aloysius O'Connell he had a big stone yard and was a regular stonemason, but he was, spoke French fluently and Italian, and he had worked for 2 years as a stonemason on the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. So when Murphy went as an apprentice into his firm, again, this wasn't a backwater. I mean, this was quite a sophisticated European tradition, stone yard. Stonemason working in a busy stone yard, and the experience that Seamus Murphy got then, and the connections that he was able to establish, and the reputation that he also was able to establish, all stood him in very good stead in the ensuing years.
And O'Connell was the traditional stone carving firm. He did an awful lot of work in Cove Cathedral, for instance, and it was the kind of thing that was handed down from one generation to the next. It wasn't what you call very creative work necessarily, in that architects, as Seamus himself said in Stone Mad, architects decided what was done, and basically the stone carvers did what they were trained to do and what the architects told them to do.
O'Connell's stone yard was next to the studio, and that was a very old stone cutting family as well, and they always shared the work, if there was something to be lifted, or that's the way they divide it, because stone cutters can shift huge stones Just using blocks, rollers and spinners.
Right.
They can move big blocks.
Without machinery.
Without machinery,
Yeah.
The first crowd to do it were the crowd building the pyramids. So we carried on from that.
It's a long enough tradition.
He did a lot of foliage carving and carving, you know, functional carving. But I think he liked that. He said himself that he liked limits, that he didn't like the idea of just completely free rein, that he liked the idea of having limits set within which then he could be creative. He also very much, I think, liked the idea of being a sort of a functioning member of society rather than an artist on the edge. He didn't fancy the sort of Van Gogh model at all, where you kind of, you know, starve in an attic and cut off your ear, and this kind of romantic idea of the artist. He saw himself as somebody who wanted to be a useful member of society, producing stuff that people wanted. And I think, for instance, the carving of tombstones very much fitted in with this.
Just seeing these fellas in their dust coats, like and covered in limestone dust, and the cowboy hats and the moustaches, and it was surreal, you know, it was amazing. And I suppose a sight that would have been common from medieval times in stone yards throughout Europe, or, you know, or throughout the world, I suppose.
It's like a last glimpse of it.
It was, yeah. I mean, I'm sure there must. I mean, I'm sure they're still building stone buildings, and they must be cutting. But I suppose all machine tools now. You know, he went to Paris and he was there, and he got a Gibson scholarship there. He was the third person to get it, which was a pittance really, like, and they were starving out there. But he was there, and it influenced him, and, you know, Montparnasse and all of that. And
on his trip to France, he kind of hung out with the students in Montparnasse and such like, but he was very turned off by all their theorising, by the abstract art discussions, and he felt, you know, all this talk but very little doing. And he tried to get them, he said, to talk about materials and to talk about stone cutting and clay modelling, and they said, oh, that's craft. And he didn't like that, and he got disinterested then in a lot of the kind of what was fine art at the time, and he started to look a lot at the buildings. And even when he had been passing through London on his way to Paris, he had mainly been interested, he said, in the buildings, the monuments, the externals of the city. So it was the same then when he went to Paris, and particularly, he said, when he went to Chartres and he saw the carvings there, and he said to himself, you know, these people, he doubted, knew anything about abstract art, and yet, as far as he was concerned, they produced the most spectacular sculpture ever, in Europe anyway.
I think he felt it might have been a mistake to come back. I think he did feel that. It was a fierce, hard life they had, himself and Mairead, like, to try and make ends meet, like, because there was still, you know, no grants, no writing off to the Arts, even though he wasn't connected, he was a member of the Arts Council subsequently. Like.
I think that was when he kind of formed this notion of the kind of sculptor he wanted to be, which was somebody whose art was a part of life, who didn't kind of theorise. I mean, he said, you know, that you must produce before you pontificate, and I think that was definitely his approach. So he looked at the sculpture of Chartres and he said, this is the kind of thing I want to do, obviously for the modern age. But this, in a way, sounds like a rejection of modern art, but in other ways it wasn't, because primitivism was very fashionable among the avant-garde at the beginning of the 20th century. The idea of looking to pre-Renaissance models, and of course medieval sculpture would have been very much an example of the kind of thing that was looked at. Other artists, such as Picasso, for instance, looked at African art. Gauguin then went to, you know, the Pacific Islands and such like. So he wasn't really out of step by doing that, but I think it wasn't so much, it affected his style. A lot of the carving he did after that was very sort of geometric and abstracted, but I think more so, and this is what it didn't do with Picasso and people like that, it affected his concept of the role of the sculptor in society and the kind of role that he wanted to play in society as a sculptor, which was as a working man, as part of society.
Artists have always been involved in the community. It's really only since the sort of beginning of the Renaissance or middle of the Renaissance that artists were hothouse plants living on their own outside the community, doing specialised kind of work. Whereas before, artists were involved in the very fabric of society, and you're commissioned to do things. And of course, the contemporary art world see commissions as being hackwork, which is rubbish really, because all you're doing is someone says to me, well, will you make me a set of Stations of the Cross, say, for a cathedral? But I get completely freedom to do what I want, obviously. But I mean, with their approval and so forth, and looking at the building and in relation to the building, making something that's appropriate and right, and then entering into a relationship with somebody for a project that will take so long, and they know that, and for how much money, you know that. And it's not a question of just making something in an attic and then putting it into a thing called a gallery and then hoping you might sell it. Most of my work and most of Seamus's work, sometimes one does do carvings that are just simply out of one's head and sells them maybe in a joint exhibition, but mostly it's people who want something, commission something.
It's a bit of a mixture of craft and art as well. It's not it's the old craft of stone carving, and yet also the artistic side. I mean, if some of my sculptures are very artistic and some of the lettering is more the craft, and you have to be able to do both. That's why I think I was attracted to stone carving, because it's not, it's definitely something very physical about stone carving, and you have to be quite disciplined because it takes so long. You have to really kind of, it focuses the mind.
Everything that I've gleaned and learned about Seamus Murphy, he was an immensely practical man, as well as being an artist of very considerable talent. So when he returned from Paris, having gone there on a Gibson scholarship from the Crawford School of Art in Cork, he came back to a city where he knew that he could make a living, but he would not make a living primarily by doing portrait busts or commissions for churches. He would make a living doing gravestones and lettering, and he combined the two, and it was a very sensible, quite a clever decision. He went back almost to the Renaissance tradition, or the pre-Renaissance tradition of the stonemasons, say, who journeyed throughout Europe, carving Gothic, Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals, who combined immense artistic, expressive qualities in their work, and also they were journeymen. They were almost, in most cases, anonymous.
His studio, there was O'Connell's monumental works there before the bank took over the corner. That's the AIB bank down in Watercourse Road. So he just actually put a kind of a shade, a lean-to shade, and he did his work there.
I think it was a sensible decision that he took, and if he had elected to, say, stay in Paris, he would have been just one sculptor amongst many. He also would have been at the ferment of the conflict between tradition and modernism, and he wasn't somebody to enter that conflict, if you like. He himself, I think, was far more interested in a sort of reconciliatory type of art, an art that would have elements of modern idiom in it, modern feeling in it, but would also be quite traditional and quite rooted in the centuries-old tradition of stonemasons and stone carvers. So in Cork, although he identified himself very much with the stonemasons, fraternity, and with the journeyman sculptors, and he didn't, in a sense, give himself a status, although the city did, and the Irish art world did accord him a high status. He himself had a very refreshing, I guess, humble approach to himself, to his art, and You know, as he remarked to somebody, you know, there was a great deal of mythologizing about him, a great deal of myth-making about him. He himself was far happier just to go down to the local pub after a day's work and have a pint, and he wasn't interested himself in the mythologizing.
Wherever there's dust, there's drink, because you can't have dust without some sort of thing to
wash it away.
To wash it away.
Including black.
We're very, very proud of him, and thinking I never had the guts to actually go in to his studio, going up and down. I'd say hello to him, all right, and he'd be over a fag. And by the water trough there was a favourite place for people just to sit down and have a fag and say hello to people up and down. So the church that was designed by himself, slightly different from the drawings, as we have the drawings as well. And it was just great that he was included so much in that church, because unfortunately there's not a great deal of his work elsewhere in the area.
Right.
Seamus Murphy was never anonymous, and you always find a Seamus Murphy gravestone will be known, remembered and identified as a Seamus Murphy gravestone, because people in Cork took tremendous pride in having a Seamus Murphy gravestone. It was a status symbol, not a symbol. There was a very high status attached to having a good Seamus Murphy gravestone, which has lasted through the generations, and they're still very highly regarded today.
Now, on a practical level, he did it because it was a way of earning money, but I don't think it was something that went against his philosophy or his image of himself as a stone carver. I think it was something that very much fitted in there, and I think that's one of the reasons he did it. And he did it, you know, he did it in a very single-minded way. He did it in his own way. He developed his own way of doing letters and such like. He reacted against the kind of very poor lettering and over-decoration of the Victorian period, which was kind of the fashion until then. And so I think he did it with a kind of a single-minded sort of purpose, the same way as he did all his work, as far as I can see.
John Charles McQuaid had a head done by Seamus, commissioned a head, which, I mean, people can judge themselves as to whether it's a fairly accurate likeness or not. I feel that it is. John Charles didn't like it anyway, and he instructed Connie Lucy that my father wasn't to get any more work. And it was up then to independent priests, of which there were quite a few, to their credit, who supported my father. But outside of that, like, my father never mentioned that, but that's my understanding of the situation. I may be wrong, but that's my understanding.
He had views on religion. He wasn't very religious at all, you know.
I think he used to describe the difference between getting a commission, say, from the Church of Ireland, which was fairly businesslike, and the Catholic Church, is that it would be, you'd be summoned and you'd be commissioned, and then it would all be forgotten about, and you'd have to hound them for, not all of them obviously, like, and I'm not saying them in a pejorative way, but I mean, for instance, in Carrigaline, the church there's 4 evangelists there, and while he was waiting to be paid, which he refused to get off the job. So if you look at there's a wren in one corner, and there's on the eagle, which would be the story about the king of all birds, which he put in because he was waiting around to get paid, like, so. Everything has a knock-on effect, and I think that would be interesting about Seamus, that in my view, that he was kind of, everything was connected with everything else, and he wasn't in the narrow sense that people like to call themselves artists these days, where they're so precious about themselves alone, that everything was interconnected. And I think that kind of described his relationship between art and craft and stone carving and painting and modelling and sculpture, so that it was a kind of a larger picture, really.
He said one time, I'd be sure to tell my sins to a farmer's son that knows as much about religion as a bull to open a garden gate, you know.
So that very clearly states what he thought.
Yeah.
He became a sculptor who is inextricably identified with the early years of the Irish Free State, and he sculpted portrait busts of several of the presidents of the Irish Free State, and he also cultural figures, poets such as John Montague and Frank O'Connor and others, and so he really became an artist who, more than any other, barring perhaps Sean Keating, has become identified with providing us with the visual record of Ireland during an extraordinary period following the War of Independence and through then the period of the emergency and into the 1950s. Times of great austerity for artists in very many cases, and yet years during which Seamus Murphy was able to survive.
I mean, I think that is true, and I think he would have taken that role very seriously. He would have seen it as something that was important. It would have fitted in with his idea of being a central member of society, of a sculptor as having a very definite function within society. And that was a function, I think, that he took on very enthusiastically, the idea of documenting the revolutionary period, and then, you know, the fact that this was important to people in the new Irish state, that these images should be created and should be made, and that this sort of new Irish state should have these kind of heroic figures, as they would have, or important figures at least, that they should be a part of the culture of the early part of the state.
This is here, yes. That's James Connolly's daughter, and so she is writing to Seamus, very friendly, lovely letter, and talking about the head that he had then made of her father, James Connolly. And she says, "You'll be interested to hear that I have had an old citizen army man to see the photographs of the bust. His comment was," and she quotes, "tell him to take the curve off the nose and shorten the chin a bit, and then don't let him do another ha'porth to it." And he also said the uniform was right and there were no letters on the collar. And so you get that kind of wonderful detail, which of course was very important to him. It's not just that they're charming and beautiful in themselves, and the daughter of James Connolly, you know, you would keep such a letter, but they were so precise and they were so involved, and he was so anxious for people to be involved.
The busts of figures that he did are done in a kind of a naturalistic, slightly expressionist style. But like the monuments, for instance, the Jail Cross monument in Cork, which presents the list of names in this Irish clo, the old Irish script, and he has adapted it for his typographic purposes. And he does it very effectively, actually. It's a very impressive piece of work.
You know, when you think of his major sculptures, the Virgin of the Twilight and the other Madonna figures, they're very tender, and in a way, you know, this is being very, reading too much into it, but when you think of the death of all his sisters and the grieving that his mother must have endured, I think this is a real background for Seamus Murphy. That's what gives his work a perennial, you know, people can empathise with it, they can sense that in his work. So that's the real context, I think, for Seamus Murphy's work, rather than the grand sculpture of, you know, the sort of the Irish Republic. It's in those qualities that of lines on faces and catching a kind of a wistful expression, which he is a real master at doing. That's what makes his work very special, and it also made him special as a human being. So he was very self-deprecating. You know, he didn't aggrandize himself at all. And it's only with the passing of, say, for 30, 40 years, and now, you know, with when people look back and they want to create a sense of the visual art tradition of the early years of the Irish Republic, and they invest Murphy with a great deal that he himself would not really be that interested in. I think there's an intimacy, I think, about Seamus Murphy's work, and it's so connected with his life, with his background, with his roots. But I mean, in the sense that Ireland, in the years of 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, did have periods of great economic adversity, and there was not a great deal of money about, and people were very hard up, and life was a struggle, and there was high infant mortality and so on. That in that way, I think Murphy does speak about his times, his people, in a very genuine way.
Well, I started carving stone in 1969. Rather a circuitous route to get to that point, but having got there, I decided, why don't I come back to Cork, where my family came from, and start carving stone there. I have to admit, I didn't actually know of Seamus Murphy. I was so ignorant at that time. And I suppose I was very influenced by Eric Gill and some of the English carvers. But when I did come back and set up carving stone, I found Seamus incredibly warm and friendly and encouraging.
The thing about Murphy was that I think he was always very approachable, and he was never aloof. And if any young artist came looking and just wanted to see what he was doing, I think he was generous with his time, because certainly when you read the reminiscences of those who met him, who visited Cork, who went to visit him at his studio or at his home, the one thing that you do get is a sense in which he had time for people. And he was generous with that time. In fact, given all of those sort of semi-official duties, in a sense, that he had to carry out, you'd wonder how he got so much time to actually produce so many sculptures, so many headstones, because his output was considerable. And I think that it's in his support for young artists like John Burke that, again, a quality of his generosity shows through, because he might not have liked John Burke's sculpture. He might not have thought much of the welded steel, new, innovative, abstract sculpture that was beginning to come into the School of Art in the early 70s. But nonetheless, he could see the quality of the intention, and he respected the ambition of the artists, and I think that is one of the marks of Seamus Murphy's generosity of spirit.
In the house, they used to have people in and friends, but again, I would have been a little bit young for that, but other people could describe that better. But I know that it happened, and that there was lots of interesting people in music, and this room used to have great, particularly around Christmas and stuff. There'd be the late Tommaso Canning used to play here, and all kinds of visiting. Micheál MacLeamore slid down the banisters out there at one point, and successfully. And there was all. I remember Edna O'Brien apparently felt faint one day and had to lie down in for half an hour. There was all these people coming and going, and I suppose they were all kindred spirits, because and you couldn't swing a cat now with hitting an artist, whereas in those days you were very isolated.
In the 1981 edition of the Cork Review, Louis has a very fine article in which he refers to this house as a hedge school. And I think that all ties in, and I'm pretty sure he said that at the graveside as well. And it did, the door was always open. No doors were in those days, but you never knew who would turn up. Leon Uris and his wife turned up the day after Seamus, the day of the funeral, in fact, not knowing that he had died, because he had made a head of Leon Uris, and of course they were great friends, and there are letters from him there. But there would have been everybody you think of, say Maurice Gorham, who was the director of RTE, I think, at one stage, and there was, George Morrison, who made Mishera, he was here at another time. It was impossible. There was every sort. There was Liam Robinson, who was he was a journalist, and there's a beautiful head of Liam, who's one of the heads that Seamus made in fallow times when he had nothing to do, so he just made a few heads, and then he would choose people who he said had a beautiful head, and Liam Robinson had a beautiful head.
it would have been different in as much as what went on in the house, like, as there would have been, as well as conversations about Gerald McCarthy or Ray Cummins, there would have been conversations about Leon Uris or somebody else that would have had his head done. And I suppose in that sense it was different, but I didn't feel any way different, no, except that I suppose, not unlike other people, that the income was fairly haphazard, like. Not that I mean, I was always, isolated from that, but I mean, I suppose it was working independently, like that was kind of, but I suppose other people were doing things too, but I suppose it was different, but I didn't really perceive it that way. Like.
As he was getting older, he was finding it more difficult to engrave the letters. So he needed someone, when he'd get a commission for a headstone, to cut the letters. And what he would do, he'd mark them out, and I'd cut them then with a hammer and chisel.
Right.
So they were actually his letters.
Right.
He adored letters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially the V cut, which you don't get now with the sandblasting. The interior of the letters are flat from sandblasting. But the properly cut Roman letters would have a V cut in like this.
Yeah, well, we go back, myself, I'm the 6th generation, the McCarthy stone cutting in Cork. My father and his father before me served my time under my grandfather. My dad worked with Seamus, and like that, Seamus would send him a postcard to call out to the studio for some work or whatever they were doing at the time, and that's how they did their business then. No mobile phones at the time. He
was on the edge, really, and I do think that he would have a sort of a stronger legacy, appear to have a stronger legacy if he had been more centrally located, if he had been in Dublin or if he had emigrated. And he said something about how, that a lot of people felt you had to go to the centre, like Paris was at the time of the art world, that you had to go to the centre. But he actually said that when he came home, that he realised that he had left nothing behind in Paris that he couldn't find in Ireland. But I think maybe opportunities on a practical level were the one thing that he had left behind. Now, having said that, I don't think it would have suited him. I mean, it was part of his vision of himself that it would be his own people, his own culture, his own city that he would settle among and that he would, work in. So you just can't imagine him having settled in Paris or anywhere else other than Cork, but it's very hard to know. When he was a young man, the possibilities could have been very different. Well, I think there had to have been a sense of lost opportunities. I mean, in many ways, he was born too early. The sculptors who kind of matured later, especially after Vatican II, when the church, took on a whole different approach to art and a much stricter approach to high quality art, and when the mass-produced devotional images were less approved of, they did much better. People like Michael Biggs and such like. Seamus was born at the wrong time. He matured at the wrong time for that, and it was bad luck, really, from that point of view.
The merchant princes of Cork did, to I think the best of their ability, rally around, and families like the Barrys and the Carneys and Aliaga Kellys, they all supported and commissioned him to do works, and those works are in the St. Joseph's Cemetery in St. Finbarr's today. So, although there were lean years when he did not earn a great deal of money, he managed to survive and thrive in conditions that other artists would simply have found too much, and to make ultimately to make a fantastic success through the various works that he did, whether they're monuments in Dripsy to the War of Independence, individual portraits, church commissions, or just work that he did off his own bat. It's quite an extraordinary record that he's left us.
I don't remember him ever kind of not doing things. He was either in hospital or he was out there working and loving it.
I mean, he lost toes, all but 2 toes on 1 foot from a stone falling off the back of a lorry onto his foot. It's an interesting story and relates to this room, actually, that his toes had to be amputated. That was done, and he was convalescing over there. And a friend of his, I don't remember this, so it must have been back in the day, arrived down from Dublin and came in, and they smelt gangrene, and put him into the car and drove straight back up. And his life was saved, really, or certainly his leg was saved. Correct. You know, so it was physical as well as you know, in the artistic.
Yeah.
Or even craft. I mean, very physical. Like, there was a lot of manhandling going on. Like,
yeah.
Others who were there, all those writers, Frank O'Connor, I remember him sitting in this very space, and he had been to a dance, and at this stage he was married to the beautiful Harriet, and they had little Hallie Og, and I'm not quite sure why Frank O'Connor at this stage, Michael O'Donovan, of course, his real name, had been to a dance, but it was the era of the twist, and he said suddenly we saw all these young people enjoying themselves, you know, another kind of eye-opener to how things just blossomed. And of course they blossomed partly through the courage of, you know, the musicians and the writers and the painters and the poets, people who couldn't be put down. I mean, like O'Connor himself, you know, he was put down, but he didn't let it stop him. And Seamus was the same. They had this just absolutely worker bee determination. And I wondered, though, latterly, and this is only my own wondering, if his, again, larger than life-sized portrait of St. Patrick, which is in Maynooth, and in fact there's a letter in there from the Archbishop of Armagh, I think it was, about the placing of that beautiful shining black polished limestone head, whether that in fact had some influence. I think it was made around about 1953, and that would have been around the time that he was in Rome, and there is possibly the Michelangelo Moses, or one of those truly monumental things, would have something of that in that head. If you look at the St. Patrick, it was a complete break. In fact, going back to the idea of there being an Irish tradition, it was a complete break from, you know, the crozier and the shamrocks and the greenery aspect of it. And this is a very fine portrait of more or less any man of tremendous aspect, you know.
I go around the country, I go to church, I see Seamus's work, and now he's dead 40 years, and he's still alive, you know. His work is shining out, and it's still a beacon, it still speaks, you know.
coincidental to your calling, the post this morning, we had this class of fifth class from Scoil Oliver in Ballyvillan, which is near the Fox and Hounds. They rang their teacher, Caroline rang there about 5 or 6 months ago to say they were doing a project on the Church of the Annunciation, which my father designed for William Dwyer. The long and the short of it, they arrived up here and there was 25, 26, 27 of them there, and but they were very proud of the place below, and it really struck me that, you know, that not alone would they not have been born when my father was alive, but the school wasn't even there. And, you know, they weren't really looking at him as sort of an antiquity or something they had to do, but they were very proud of it, which, in terms of a community which you're referring to, I think, I thought was eye-opening, really, that they came up and they were very, what did he like to eat, and what was his favourite music, and what was his favourite colour, but they were very interested in what he did down there, and they had watched a documentary about a priest that had connections with Cork that was in Rome, and that he was talking about the various churches there that had Irish connections in Rome. So having seen that, they wrote a letter to the Pope, the new Pope, explaining that they were very pleased that they had such nice churches in Rome, but that they had a church designed by Seamus Murphy in Blackpool. So, you know, that was their feeling of pride. So I was very taken by that, and it's, you know, such a time after Seamus's life that for that to be cropping up.
The little girl observing his work on her way to school every day out in the yard in Blackpool, and her question to him in the end when the beginnings of the bus emerged, and she said to him, "How did you know that was in there all the time?" You know, so which was a kind of a profound remark for a child, you know.